Welcome everyone to the second webinar in Sustainable Conservation Solutions in Our Soil webinar series. Thank you all for joining us today. And thank you to our generous sponsors, Environmental Science Associates, Holland and Knight, Spotswood Estate Vineyard and Winery, and Iron Horse Winery. Thank you for supporting our Spring 2023 webinar series and for sharing Sustainable Conservation's vision of stewarding our most precious natural resources for all Californians. My name is Sarah Castle, and I'm a Senior Research Analyst at Sustainable Conservation. For those of you who don't know us, Sustainable Conservation is a California-based nonprofit organization that advances the collaborative stewardship of California's land, air, and water for the benefit of nature and people. Just as the webinar title suggests, our recently launched program looks to the solutions in our soil to ask the question of how soil health can help California and agriculture be more resilient to climate change. Today's webinar will focus on the connection between soil and water, why it matters for California's communities, and some solutions for making progress. If you haven't had a chance to listen to our first webinar of this series, I would highly recommend it. And we will put a link to the recording in the chat. It's a fantastic conversation about soil health with my colleague, Ryan Flaherty, and author, researcher, and agroecologist, Dr. Liz Carlisle. Before we get started, we'd like to get to know our audience with a few poll questions. Where are you joining from today? What best describes your affiliation? And how would you rate your knowledge on soils and water? We'll give you a minute or two to answer the poll, and then we'll talk about the results. I'm seeing some responses come in. Give you a little bit more time. Okay, we're almost there. And if you don't see your answers reflected in the answer choices, please feel free to answer in the chat as well. All right, we are closing the poll. So this is interesting. It looks like we have a lot of folks calling in from the Bay Area, Sacramento Valley, San Joaquin Valley, and some folks from out of state. Welcome. And we have a good mix of different backgrounds. We have a lot of nonprofit and government folks, a couple folks from agriculture, and a couple from academia. That's great. Welcome. And you know, most people joining are coming from an average water and soils background. I can say honestly, we have a really interesting conversation today that I think will have something for everyone. So thanks for responding to those poll questions. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing three guests who come to the issues of soil and water from really different standpoints. Janaki Anagha is the Director of Community Advocacy at Community Water Center. Janaki's work is rooted in environmental justice for communities and workers bearing the burden of California's food system. Janaki has also farmed and diversified in orchard systems across the state. Welcome, Janaki. Charles Delgado is our policy director at Sustainable Conservation. Before coming to Sustainable Conservation, Charles spent a decade with the State Water Resources Control Board, working on major policy initiatives and the provision of safe and affordable drinking water, groundwater management, drought response, and many other issues. Welcome, Charles. And finally, we have Dr. Hannah Waterhouse. Hannah is transitioning from a postdoc position at UC Berkeley to a professor position at UC Santa Cruz in the Environmental Studies Department. Grounding her work in a socioeconomic context, Hannah's research examines how soil health management can be tailored to different soil types to mitigate agriculture's impact on the environment, with a particular focus on nitrogen cycling, water provisioning, and water quality. Welcome, Hannah. Before we get started, I just have a few notes on logistics. We'll spend 45 minutes in conversation and then 10 to 15 minutes answering your questions. For those of you in the audience, if you have questions, we encourage you to ask lots of questions. Please put those in the Q&A chat box, and we'll get to your questions as soon as we can. Hopefully we can get through everything, but we will follow up if we don't. All right, Janaki, Hannah, Charles, welcome. Thank you so much for being here today. First, I just want to invite each of you to share a little bit about yourself and how you think about soil and water broadly in the context of your work. Janaki, do you want to kick us off? And then we'll go to Charles and then Hannah.
Yeah, I'd be glad to, Sarah. Hi, everyone. I'm Janaki Anaga, Director of Community Advocacy at Community Water Center. And folks who are on the line may recognize Community Water Center as an organization that has worked on environmental justice issues as they pertain to drinking water for 18 years. And our organization has been rooted in grassroots community voices the entire time. We have our offices in Visalia, which is in southern Tulare County, and in Watsonville on the Central Coast, and in Sacramento, where I am currently. And our work, of course, is focused primarily on the hundreds of small community water systems that currently lack safe and affordable drinking water. And myself, as the Director of Community Advocacy and an attorney, I work alongside those community residents on the ground who are contending with some of these agricultural pollution and quantity issues that are by and large created by industrial scale agriculture. We have significant information that shows us where these specific contamination and quantity issues are. And of course, we're involved in kind of the policy process to obtain solutions for all of those. And for me, as somebody who comes from agriculture and specifically has a soil background, I see the relationship of soils to be really inextricable with the lives of communities on the ground and the environmental justice issues that we deal with, because the communities currently that lack safe and affordable drinking water, they're not there because of a coincidence. They're there as a part of the history of agricultural development in California, and specifically a history that has prioritized large-scale agriculture and has imported a way of constructing the way we employ people from the American South, where we have large tracts of agricultural land and tiny farm worker settlements that are in the interstitial spaces of these large agricultural land holdings. And it's not a coincidence that those communities that are nested in those places, who deal with a variety of different issues, from a lack of access to the polling place because of their citizenship status, all the way to access to healthcare and other kind of basic needs, are also coming home to water that they can't drink after working in the field for many hours picking and processing our food. And so when we start to ask ourselves how we heal soil, we of course ultimately end up with the question of how we heal our agricultural system and ultimately fix some of those long-term issues that have been plaguing our communities for generations. So it's an exciting time to be a part of these discussions, and I'll hand it back to you, Sarah.
Right, thank you so much for that. Charles?
Hi, good morning, everybody. So I'm Charles Delgado, Policy Director for Sustainable Conservation. As mentioned in the intro, I come from a water regulators background with the State Water Resources Control Board for about 13 years. So the issue of water is not a new one. Soil is a bit more of a new subject for me since I joined Sustainable Conservation. And in that lens, it's been an interesting journey just to really begin to understand how linked the management of soil and the practices that we use, for the purposes of agriculture, but then just for all the different, land uses that we encounter. One thing that struck me as I've learned more and kind of interacted with the folks engaging in these practices, the folks reliant upon the management of the soil and everyone that's affected by the water, quality impacts from soil management, is that, these practices that we see, there's a lot of practices that are just long established. There's a lot of really very knowledgeable folks from all sides of these issues. I've spoken with farmers, I've spoken with community advocates, tribal experts, just folks with a lot of deep experience here. So to me, the issue has been interesting in that it's not necessarily we're going to just do things radically differently. I think we have practices that have been shown to have beneficial effects in that water soil space. And I really think it's translating them for this new environment we find ourselves in, which is a regulatory environment, which is in the context of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and sort of the new realities that that's presenting for everybody in the state, because everyone in the state is affected by how we manage these resources. So that's, to me, where a lot of really the collaboration and the excitement comes from, is just adapting these practices, just encouraging implementation and adoption of things that have been shown to be effective, really quantifying the benefits of that, and then building them into these structures that we're still developing, because we're all still, learning as we manage the issues and the challenges that are before us. And I'll go ahead and I'll pass it back to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Charles. And Hannah.
Thanks, Sarah. So I'm a soil scientist by training, and so I'm just going to center soils here for a second. Soil is at the interface of water and air, the quality of all three, which really determine human and ecosystem health. So when I think about water, I think about soil, as Janaki said, they're inextricably linked. Soil filters almost all of our water. So almost every drop of water that falls in the state and isn't evaporated makes its way through the soil and eventually ends up in our reservoirs, our lakes, our rivers, and our aquifers. And this water will eventually make its way to our agricultural fields and to our taps. And so, having an understanding of how water is routed through the soil to these different pools is incredibly important for estimating, the quantity and the timing of water availability. And it's especially important for water quality and what that will mean for ecosystem and human health. Where my research comes in is really understanding how different soil types respond to different soil health management practices. And I really want to highlight here that, soils can be incredibly different in terms of the way they might respond to certain soil health practices. And that will have implications for, environmental productivity and human health outcomes. And so in particular, my research is focusing on how soil health practices affect water provisioning and nitrogen cycling and fate in the environment, and what that really means for water quality. And so, I think Janaki was right on. When we talk about water quantity and quality, we really have to talk about soils as well, because they're so interconnected.
Thank you, Hannah. And I want to dig into what you're talking about in the relationship between water and soil a little bit. As you all mentioned, as we think of better ways to manage water resources, the one solution that's getting a lot of attention is focusing on our soil health. And Hannah, you've spent so much time thinking about this. I'm wondering if you could break this down for us a little bit. And I'm really interested in what you're saying about the variability. Not all soils are the same. What are some of the inherent functions of soils that make them so important for things like water quantity and water quality?
Yeah, so I'm a pretty visual person, and I'm going to attempt a metaphor here, and hopefully it lands. We can really think of inherent soil properties, so like soil texture, as this kind of abiotic scaffolding, which provides almost a built environment for microorganisms. And these inherent properties, along with management, really influences the abundance and activity of these microorganisms. And we can really think of these organisms as almost like construction workers or engines of the soil ecosystem. They really are the engines that drive soil function. And so in a healthy soil, these construction workers build the infrastructure of soil, in this case, soil aggregates. And so soil aggregates are the fundamental building block of a healthy soil. And these aggregates really influence how water flows into and out of a soil. And so, soil aggregates help hold water in place during soil in place during large rain events. And that prevents fertile topsoil from erosion, which can not only reduce the fertility of a parcel of agricultural land, requiring more external inputs than would have otherwise been needed, but it can also cause eutrophication in surface water bodies by exporting nutrients to rivers, streams, lakes, and really wreak havoc on the water quality of those ecosystems and cause mass die-offs of fish and other fauna in these water bodies. Soil aggregates can, they can increase infiltration, so leading to water being stored in the soil. If we think about this past winter, if you've driven by any of the vast amount of agricultural land we have in the state, you can see that a lot of farmer fields had standing water on them for weeks, and that can delay operations. It can lead to water ponding and evaporation rather than that water recharging our overdrafted groundwater. And soil aggregates create this sort of lovely sponge-like environment that allow soils to store water, which we could potentially utilize for our cash crops in the spring season and reduce our irrigation needs through delayed or deficit irrigation. There's a great paper out by Scott Devine and Tobio Jean at UC Davis, where they used the soil web survey across the entire state to estimate how much every soil in the state could store water down to a meter. And if that stored water was utilized to delay irrigation, they estimated that it could save about 6 times the amount of water stored in the Shasta Reservoir. I think it was 6 or 7, something like that times. And this sponge-like environment can help filter out contaminants from infiltrating water that will, eventually percolate below the root zone and recharge our groundwater aquifers. So if we conversely think about a degraded soil, degraded soils can lead to this phenomena called preferential flow paths. And that's there are these conduits that carry water and pollutants toward groundwater faster than they would would be the case if you had that kind of sponge-like structure. And this, it leads to detrimental outcomes for drinking water quality and irrigation quality. And there's also research showing that degraded soils, this degradation of these fundamental building blocks, aggregates, can lead to increased evaporation from the soil surface. And again, not having that water go to recharging our aquifers. And so I think, ultimately soil health management practices will influence these soil hydrologic functions, including infiltration, evaporation, runoff and erosion, water holding capacity, and percolation. And this helps determine how much water we have available to us and what quality that water is.
Thank you for that. And I'm wondering if you would be willing to give us a little bit of a primer on nitrate. I know, nitrogen cycling is something that you also think a lot about when we're thinking about groundwater contamination. A lot of times we're thinking about nitrate leaching, and so what is it about that particular molecule that makes it so prone to leaching? And will you maybe just touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Soils are they have a charge. They're negatively charged, and nitrate is also a negatively charged ion. So the soil tends to repel nitrogen in the nitrate form, allowing it to really become, be a very highly mobile constituent in the soil. And so if our irrigation timing practices are off, if we're using synthetic fertilizer and then suddenly irrigating, we can really lose a lot of that nitrate that would otherwise be taken up by the plant to our groundwater aquifers. And nitrate has been linked to miscarriages via blue baby syndrome, increased risks of hypertension, and various cancers. And so really finding ways of keeping that nitrate in the root zone, in the plants, in the microbial biomass is incredibly important for groundwater quality. And soil health management practices can definitely influence the fate of that nitrate. Again, having that degraded structure and creating those preferential flow paths can accelerate the movement of nitrate toward groundwater.
Thank you for that, Hannah. That really, the human health impacts that you just mentioned kind of lead us into some of the subsequent questions that I have. You're saying these, functions of soil are really important for water. They're important for ecosystems, for agriculture, and also for our communities. Janaki, I want to bring you into the conversation now and ask you to share with us what, from your perspective, what would improved soil health mean for some of the water-related inequities that California communities are facing?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I should start by saying that to build off of what Hannah said about the health impacts of nitrate specifically, I think that nitrate as a contaminant tends to come up a lot when we're talking about soil health because it is bound up with the issue of soil fertility, right? And when we talk about having a healthy soil, much of that has to do with having a soil that is organically fertile or one that can provide fertility to a crop without having to apply additional synthetic fertilizer. And I think it's also of particular interest, nitrate is of a particular interest to both environmental justice organizations and people, as well as to the industry on account of the fact that it is increasingly regulated, not because of the goodness of anyone's heart, but because of the fact that nitrate is one of the regulated contaminants under the Safe Drinking Water Act and has a maximum contaminant level of 10 milligrams per liter. And, I really love talking about soil health as kind of like this way to fix this problem and the way that it can be a long-term solution for some of these drinking water crises. But it's important to reckon with the fact that many of the solutions that we're putting forward are only being approached and with any athleticism because of the human health impact that they're causing. Nobody would be doing that of the goodness of their own heart, right? We have human costs associated with these contaminants and a real need to fix that problem, not only because of legal and regulatory consequences, but the actual real human costs that are at the bottom of the system. And so when we talk about soil health, I mean, what's most exciting to me about that is that, as a soil scientist, we approach the question around how to assess soil health by asking the question of like, how are you doing? What's your condition? We essentially come to the question of soil health with looking at a variety of variables, because as Hannah speaks to, there are so many variables as a part of this analysis of what is a healthy soil. It's not just a one-shot question of like, is there nitrate in this soil or is there XYZ thing in this soil? You're looking at a variety of different variables. And to me, also as an environmental justice attorney, that's exactly how we want to be approaching community health as well, to look at these things holistically around, what does it take to maintain that natural fertility of that soil? And ultimately, what are the human health impacts down the road, or the human health benefits down the road? So just a few more kind of data points around what's going on with our current water situation in California. Approximately 400 small community water systems currently are out of compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act. And so that's not just nitrate, but a lot of them are with nitrate, but several other acute contaminants that cause a variety of different acute health hazards for the communities that are drinking and bathing with that water every day. And many of those small water systems are drawing from groundwater, right? That's the majority of our drinking water source in the San Joaquin Valley. They're shallow aquifers primarily. So when we're talking about sort of actually sucking up the impact of what's applied on local agriculture, that's typically where it's going. And the infrastructure costs and the solutions around fixing some of those groundwater problems for those communities, it's extremely expensive, and it's something that we work on at Community Water Center, but without fixing the source problem, essentially right now we have the faucet running of nitrate and other agrochemicals while trying to kind of create the conditions to support more soil health practices, to ensure that farmers adopt more of these practices and grow healthy soils, both for the climate benefits as well as all these other ecological benefits we're talking to. And at the same time, we need to be shutting off the faucet, right? And so kind of bringing those timelines into evenness for the benefit of low-income communities of color is really something that I think we should be talking about as a part of the long-term goal of achieving soil health across the state.
Thank you, Johnny. And I think that analogy of soil health and community health being based on more than one metric is really powerful. California is a really extreme water environment. A lot of years we have these long, really hot, dry drought spells, and then we have really intense precipitation like we saw earlier this year. And I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what these extreme water events and even just kind of like the weather whiplash of that looks like on the ground in these water insecure communities that you work with.
Yeah, and we're kind of in the process of meeting with community residents across the state at this time who are in the shadow of these flood impacts from the recent months. But if folks remember, just a few months prior to that, we're dealing with extreme drought conditions. And still, I mean, there are so many different definitions of drought, right? I mean, there's meteorological, hydrological, agricultural drought. But the important thing to remember is that those communities that were dealing with a lack of drinking water, pulling up sand from their wells are not magically recharged by these large precipitation events. And so we're still kind of dealing with both of those issues, having flooding and the infrastructure problems, and also the issues of bacterial intrusion into people's wells, as well as flushing of those contaminants, such as nitrate off of large dairy operations and synthetically applied perennial orchard fields that a lot of people are living right next to. That is happening at the same time as people are still dealing with the lack of clean drinking water in their homes and in their communities. But just to kind of keep it short around what happens after some of these events, of course, when you have a large precipitation event, and as I said, some of these aquifers are sitting around 50 to 80 feet, you've got massive flow of those contaminants into people's wells. And we're kind of struggling to kind of just follow up with what's going on with some of these public water systems, calling general managers and engineers, trying to see kind of what's the status of your recent monitoring of those wells, and has there been any spikes around these contaminants that are regulated. And then on the other side of that, of course, many like months prior to that, contending with in communities that are in the southern San Joaquin Valley, specifically dealing with overdraft of their local aquifers. So being surrounded by agriculture that has the ability to drill to a much deeper depth, right, to far beyond what domestic and small community water system wells are pulling from, and that resulting in subsidence in many places, a compression of soil. And, our water is stored in aquifers, which is these interstitial spaces within rock and sand under our feet. So when the water is pulled from that, you're really compressing all of that down in a way that it's not going to refill, as a sponge would. Instead, you just have a full scale drop of your aquifer. So, and a full scale drop of the surface of that land, causing breakage in infrastructure and foundations of homes. So those are some of the acute issues going on, which can't be fixed immediately by soil health, but these are things that can long-term, be fixed through a transition of agriculture to a larger support of the diversity of soil our soil microbiome and the people walking on top of it.
Thank you, Janaki. And what you said kind of speaks to some of our next questions. I want to shift gears because you mentioned a lot of regulations and policies that are in place to help with some of these issues that you're talking about. So I want to talk about some of those solutions we have to more sustainably manage our water. And I'm going to bring you in, Charles. Can you talk us through what's being done in the policy arena to help with these water challenges via soil health and to address these impacts to the environment and communities? And I know you mentioned SGMA a little bit in the beginning. This is a really big topic, so maybe you can kind of break it down for us around policies that are related to overpumping of groundwater and those that are more around water quality.
Certainly. Thank you, Sarah. So yeah, I did mention the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act at the front of this conversation. This is sort of the roadmap in a regulatory sense towards groundwater supply. And this is throughout, of course, the whole state. But, where we really are grappling with the challenges of implementing this kind of a policy, the Central Valley is definitely front and center for these conversations. And this is where it's really just thrown into relief the different, constituencies that depend on these groundwater supplies. In addition, we have communities that are dependent on their drinking water, and their day-to-day existence and these are heavily impacted by the overpumping and overuse of groundwater basins that have occurred up to this point. So this is a relatively recent framework. California famously is one of the last states in the country to impose any sort of meaningful controls on the use of groundwater. We've had systems in place to assign rights and usage to surface water, but groundwater up until the mid 2010s was the Wild West in all senses. So when I say that we're sort of still learning how to manage these challenges, that's definitely very true. So just for some background's sake, for the water situation, when SGMA was passed, initially the charge was to identify all the different subbasins throughout the state that we're looking at groundwater supplies. This implementation is largely left up to local actors. So SGMA mandated that we create groundwater sustainability agencies by a certain point. Once that happened, and this is all, of course, under the purview of the Department of Water Resources. So that's the state agency that's in charge of water supply. Once these agencies were formed, and these agencies are, number one, typically composed of numerous decision makers in a locality. These are a lot of the time county level government officials. These are managers of irrigation districts. So these are folks that are pretty well versed in the water world. These groundwater sustainability agencies were then charged with developing groundwater sustainability plans. And so these were basically the roadmap for how these basins were going to be brought into a sustainable state of being. The deadline, of course, in SGMA is 2040, but there's numerous benchmarks and progress that must be made as we get to that, because 2040 in some senses sounds like a long way off, although it really isn't. But there's benchmarks in between now and then. These plans were submitted for review. In some cases, they were accepted by the Department of Water Resources being adequate. In some cases, they weren't. There's a number of reasons that they can not be deemed in compliance with SGMA. There's a lot of outreach that must happen because these plans ideally should recognize all the users of water. And again, this includes the environment, this includes communities. So these are what we're aiming for when we get these plans drawn up and adopted and implemented. So we are now firmly in the implementation stage of SGMA. So we're starting to see the first attempts, not only at just putting these plans into practice, but these plans frequently mandate putting actual measurable limits on the usage of groundwater. So we're starting to see the first, what they call allocations, limitations on how much you can pump in a given year and under what conditions. So that really is sort of the master framework, which we're dealing with in terms of the supply. When it comes to water quality, there's a couple of different permits and schemes that folks are complying with as we try to address a lot of the problems that Janaki was mentioning. And primarily in the Central Valley, I mean, nitrates are definitely front and center. There's a couple of places where this interacts. It's the regional water boards. So in this case, the Central Valley Regional Water Board, but in other places such as, there's a Central Coast Regional Water Board, other places where they're doing this kind of work. They issue what's called an irrigated lands regulatory permit. So this is basically assessing how much nitrate inputs are being applied to land and managing those so that those do not percolate down below these root zones and agricultural operations and into the groundwater and thus causing pollution. In the Central Valley, we have, and I'm actually, forgive me, because I always use acronyms. I was told not to use acronyms today. In the Central Valley Regional Water Board's purview, we have the Central Valley Salinity Alternatives for Long-Term Sustainability, what most folks know as CV salts. And this is another program that's very ambitious. It's a product of years of cooperation and planning. And this is really targeting how nitrate is applied and used and coupled with just how that is going to impact drinking water quality and how we can manage those impacts. So that system relies on a number of different management zones through the Central Valley. Some of these zones are more high priority than others, so those have been starting to implement their plans in the near future. They've all had to come up with emergency action plans, and this is a recognition of the fact that folks relying on water for drinking and day-to-day use can't wait 10, 15 years for us to come into compliance. So in the meantime, the state has mandated that emergency water supplies be provided to folks in coordination with people in the communities. The levels of success which we're achieving in these programs can definitely be up for discussion. But I definitely, as a policy person, am encouraged to see at least some recognition that these are issues that require really just ambitious and wide-ranging action. And so this is what we're starting to see in the state and in the local areas which have been charged with implementing these regulatory processes and programs.
Charles, there are also some policy levers that are funding and incentives that growers can access to help reach soil health goals. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that as well.
Certainly. So in my mind, at this stage of the game, there's two primary schools of lever that we can use to kind of help to spread these practices to help people to kind of adopt them. The first is sort of in the context of the regulatory programs that I just described. And this really is primarily making sure that these permits and these programs play nicely with healthy soils practices. So when it comes to SGMA primarily, when I mentioned that we're learning, one of the things we're really learning about as we implement SGMA is just how to really quantify and measure water use in the groundwater basins. And this has required the development of technology that simply didn't exist, 5, 6, 7 years ago. And not only developing that technology, but getting it to a place where it can be accessible, both on just a technical and a cost basis to groundwater sustainability agencies and the growers and the people residing within these agencies. So this has led to advances in measurement of what they call evapotranspiration. So basically, this is the water that's coming up off of a field, and just the kinds of crops that are being grown, the time of year, the conditions, the soils. These all affect what you pump out, what you apply, how much water then goes back down into the basin, and how much is taken up by plants. So really, this is an area where we're really trying to understand the precise impacts of things like the use of cover crops, which are plants that require water to grow, but the amount of water that they use, and then it has to be factored against, how much water they're ultimately saving. You can see evidence of this if you go out into a field that's had cover cropping the past couple growing seasons, and just the quality of the soil and how much more moisture that soil retains. And then how much more infiltration. Hannah went over the benefits that we can see from soil management practices for water. So a field that makes extensive use of cover cropping, maybe the absolute amount of water applied to that field is not much different, but the amount of water that stays there and the amount of water that comes back into the basin that doesn't run off outside of the basin. So really, it's just getting to a point where we can truly understand the total impact of practices like these, and ensuring that when things like water use allocations are set, that they're mindful that these practices can have a benefit for the total water use in a region, and the benefits that we can see to this basin and getting it to sustainability. So making sure that our programs recognize fully the benefits of what we're doing out there. And then the state does have a definite role to play in terms of getting out grant funding. There are existing programs that do a lot of good work in this area, and I'm thinking of the California Department of Food and Agriculture has a Healthy Soils program, which grant money will becomes periodically available through there to kind of help foster these practices. And really that gets to, I think, the best way to ensure that we're seeing these practices adopted is that there's a certain risk involved for a grower if they're going to change the way they're doing things, and they're going to do these new practices. This is, again, we're all learning, but they're learning with their livelihood. So to have support for people willing to try out these new methods, that's really key. And the state is probably the actor best equipped to do that. And then the more success that we see, that you can, to adopt these kinds of practices, you can, implement all these different organic farming practices. You can put cover crops on your fields. You can change the way you do things, and you see those benefits. You see your neighbors doing it. You see that they're able to do it and still, make a healthy profit. That really is that's what helps sell this, and that's what helps kind of normalize these practices and makes it the way things are done. And then the more we do that, the more the benefits we see, the more success builds upon success. So any help that state agencies can provide in sort of fostering that sort of initial support, there's ongoing support in the form of technical assistance. And I really do have to kind of give a shout out to the academic institutions in the state. The University of California Cooperative Extension Centers down in the Valley have done a lot of good work here. The Department of Water Resources provides a lot of just technical assistance and the know-how to help folks as they change over their practices. So that's something that we would definitely want to encourage and see continue as a lever that kind of helps to get these practices done. And it's really just figuring out who are the leaders in this space and giving them the tools that they need to succeed. And I think that's really the future here in this space.
Thank you, Charles. And I'm not going to let us get away without talking about the Ag Order 4.0, but maybe we can come back to that. I also, want to recognize here that policies don't always encourage what we want to happen, and we can't regulate away all of our problems. So I'd like to bring Janaki and Hannah back into this question of thinking about how we get policies to do good things. Janaki, do you want to touch on that first?
Yeah, and it's an interesting question. I think, of course, when we utilize an environmental justice framework, typically the um, the strategies revolve around regulating away the issues that cause acute health harms that are disproportionately burdening communities of color. But what's interesting about soil health and being a part of discussions around an evolving agriculture is that it's an opportunity to think about alliance building, and it's an opportunity to think about how the agricultural industry has been constructed in such a way that we have, of course, farmers across the San Joaquin Valley and on the Central Coast who, for the past several decades, have been just thinking about soil purely for its chemical and physical properties and not as biological ones, right? And thinking about soil not as a living organism, but rather as a thing that can be manipulated to create to bring about the best crop. And that therein is a problem where you have communities that live in those interstitial spaces having to drink and breathe and live in the consequences of those land use decisions. But as we try to shift that thought process around how to cultivate life and how to maintain a healthy microbial environment in your soil and how to treat soil as a living thing, then there's as I said in the beginning, this opportunity to kind of consider how those impacts of your land management practices have a ripple effect to sustain life. Imagine if we were not just regulating to the point of survival, but supporting to the point of thriving in some of these small communities that should be, having access to the same life expectancy as the rest of us, right? I mean, the farm worker life expectancy continues to hover around 54 years for a healthy male farm worker in California. So, I mean, the connections here are huge, and to think about how to make policy work. I mean, I'll kind of like go back to what Charles said about these partnerships, and especially around people like the cooperative extension. We have to look at our agricultural census and see whom within the state are the first and last to adopt some of these practices, and try to think about why that is and how to accelerate adoption of these practices and this shift that I'm talking about in the places where it matters most. And of course, we have to do that with both carrots and sticks, as they say. There has to be the opportunity for people to participate in these programs and to be paid for their courage to really make different land management practices and shift their thought process. But of course, as I said as well, that the house is flooding with nitrate and other pesticides and agrochemicals, and there has to be someone to shut off the tap on the other side, so that there's also space and maybe urgency to adapt and change some of these practices on a timeline that allows for survival for everyone. So I know I'm answering a question with more questions, but really it's, to me, creating policy that is responsive to this time means looking at communities the way we are beginning to look at our soil microbial communities. How do we cultivate life and maintain a healthy environment, and begin to look at all the variables that impact the health and sustainability of that place? And not to be too Horton here's a who about it, but really it's all about the little guys that live in the soil, right? I mean, we talk about soil and soil health in this way. I mean, it's all about sustaining that life, and they're the ones who provide the food at the end of the day for our plants and for us, and have the ability to also for us to partner with those microbes to filter water and improve local air quality and climate outcomes.
Thanks, Janaki. Hannah, what do you have to add to this?
Yeah, so I'm not I do research that's relevant to policy, but I'm not a policy expert. So it's really not my wheelhouse. But I think, three things that I'm thinking about. I think we really need to have policies that are crafted with stakeholders at the table, and with multiple disciplinary expertise there as well. And really look at the system holistically and think about trade-offs. So for example, recharge is not going to solve all our groundwater overdraft issues. There's just not enough water supply in this sort of climate whiplash that you referenced earlier. And so, a lot of GSAs are talking about land fallowing. But if we think about land fallowing in the Central Valley, that could cause or exacerbate the dust issues and the pesticides carried on that dust to detrimentally affect air quality. So, really thinking about these things holistically, having both natural and social scientists at the table. When I think about the agricultural order, Sarah, you mentioned that earlier. So this is an order that regulates nitrogen discharges on the Central Coast. And, they are, in ways doing really exciting things by giving credits for cover cropping to try and incentivize that practice. But from a lot of the growers on the ground that we heard from, the requirements to receive that credit is to have a winter cover crop for 3 months that reaches a certain amount of biomass. That's going to require water. And so we need to better understand the balance between how cover crops affect the water balance and water quality. But they also said that it doesn't work for their timing for contracts. So I think while we're thinking about policy levers, we also need to think about our supply chain and how we can make that perhaps more flexible, so that growers can implement these practices that are having so many benefits. And I really agree with Janaki when we are talking about, some of these practices have trade-offs in terms of yields. And that's just, we can work on trying to reduce that trade-off. But if we're asking growers to implement these practices for the benefit of society, we need to be paying them for it, in my opinion. And I think finally, from system level, if we're thinking about land tenure, a lot of soil health practices take a while to see the benefits. So they're cumulative effects, they take a long time to see. And if you're leasing land for 3 years and you don't own that land, it's a hard sell to invest in practices that will make that land potentially more valuable, and you won't see the benefits of it. So I think we really need to think about land tenure and access. And, I think as well as access to some of the programs that Charles was talking about in terms of the Healthy Soils program, really allowing, those writing a grant can bring up barriers for, say, if your first language isn't English. And so writing and receiving a grant, for example, from farmers who are already doing those practices and not getting the benefit of a payment from a grant, because perhaps they aren't comfortable writing in English, we need to help them because they're doing that work, at least from on the ground, what I've seen, especially on the Central Coast. So yeah, those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Hannah. Charles, do you want to add any quick thoughts to that before we turn it over to the audience?
I just want to reinforce, Ag Order 4.0 hopefully got mentioned both by you and Hannah. I view that as sort of kind of a prototypical example of how policy can be structured to really assist in implementation and adoption of these practices. I'm not going to say it's a finished product because it's not. There's still a lot of questions to be answered as that gets rolled out in the Central Coast region. But the idea of getting to that place where we can quantify benefits, that these healthy soil practices can prevent X amount of nitrates from coming down into the water and kind of ensuring that we avoid contamination of water supplies. So that's a precedent. I think it's a very useful precedent, and I think it's something that can be looked to as inspiration as we continue to look at how we regulate application of nitrates and how we look at how healthy soils practices can be used to help ameliorate that.
Thanks for that. I have so many questions, and it looks like we are going to run short on time. So I'm going to turn it over to a couple of audience questions, and maybe we'll circle back with my final questions. One question that I'm seeing through the chat is, what are the causes of unhealthy soils, and are there examples of counties, cities, or water agencies implementing policies to ensure the soils are healthy? Any piece of that? Hannah, it seems like maybe you should address the causes of unhealthy soils. Janaki, feel free to jump into that too.
Yeah, I think, the system we have has mainly been focused on maximizing yields and productivity, and that requires it's an extractive process. And so it requires external inputs that are usually, when we're talking about synthetic inputs, they have a huge greenhouse gas footprint to make. And so we have kind of ignored understanding the ecological processes that can help sort of create a self-sustaining system. Any system is going to need some kind of input. You're planting a plant that, naturally probably wouldn't be there, and you're harvesting it off the soil. So you are exporting nutrients with that plant, no matter what. And so you'll have to have some type of input, but the extent of those inputs we've largely been dependent on external inputs, more than sort of creating these recycling processes in the soil that could help maintain the fertility and yield of the product that we're growing, that we eventually export. And so, things like not building up our organic matter by inputting compost or retaining residue on, from the plant that we harvested on the soil. Tillage is a huge, you think about those machines are really heavy, they're going in, they're breaking up aggregates, they're introducing a lot of oxygen into those soils, and microbes love oxygen just like we do, and that kickstarts their metabolism, and they start breaking down organic matter and carbon and releasing it into the air as CO2, which is a greenhouse gas. And so I think that's kind of how we got here, is we're asking the land to produce above and beyond what it would be able to without these like heavily external inputs. I think, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, Janaki, I know you talked a lot about the microbial community, kind of taking care of the little guys. Wondering if you have anything else you want to add here.
Yeah, I think for the person who asked this, it's good to remember that it was only in the early 1900s that we started using synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. And when we look at output from farms, typically we're looking at what the crop output was from that farm using synthetic fertilizer that was applied. But when we look at, it might be like, look at 60% or 70% of what was produced, like how much nitrogen was taken up from that crop. But I think something to look at moving forward is, how about the rest of it? What was created without using nitrogen fertilizer? And how did we do that? It's like kind of a magical and incredible thing to think about, that there's this other side of the equation that we typically aren't looking at, because we're over here kind of tied up with the question of how we achieve a certain yield using these agrochemical inputs. And it's only quite recently that we start to look at soil as healthy or unhealthy. Well, thankfully, we have this kind of nomenclature around healthy soil to be thinking about all of these different variables that go into what a healthy soil is. But quite frankly, it's very recent that we have such a dichotomy in our minds. And so, you know, when you ask what causes unhealthy soil, it's mining of our microbial community without giving anything back to it, right? And applying things that will burn them. I mean, if you take anhydrous ammonia and expose yourself to it, that's going to hurt, right? And that's what we apply to our soil, and it burns the heck out of everything that's alive in that soil. So just take those things into consideration of what we apply to our soil when we started to apply those in direct opposition to kind of what we're talking about today, which is cultivating health and life within that soil without those additional inputs. And history will tell you when the things that have caused unhealthy soil over the course of time.
I'll just sneak in really quick there and add that I think that in addition to everything else, and I totally agree with how this has been presented, you know, I think that the incentive structure has been a huge cause of unhealthy soils over the past century of agriculture. You know, and I say that because, you know, what's the primary thing on someone's mind as they're growing, you know, and they're using these various synthetic inputs. I mean, this is how it's done. This is how it's been done. These are the results that we've seen because all of the market structures, all of the regulatory structures have encouraged this way of doing things. And I think that's where, you know, there's all these conversations about the levers that we can employ. I think that's really the guiding principle to all of it is how do we set up a structure, it's an environment in which the incentives all point towards these more sustainable practices that are beneficial for everybody. And that includes the growers, that includes the people, that includes the environment.
Right. I'm looking a little bit across the Q&A box here, and I'm seeing a question about equity, and I'm going to merge it with other questions. So, you know, what you all are talking about is kind of working together and collaboration that needs to happen in order to get soils in a healthy place across the state. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to that kind of coming together and then how we do that in an equitable way that works for everyone. And maybe I'll start with you, Charles, and then we'll just go Janaki and Hannah. We only have a couple minutes left, so this is a lightning round.
I'll actually echo a point that Hannah brought up earlier and say that, you know, the accessibility to these efforts of ours, access to technical assistance, access to grant funding, access to these resources that we'll need to implement that. Language is definitely something that we should make sure that we have adequate resources in place so that all of our different farming communities can avail themselves of these practices. And that technical assistance piece, I really think that's hugely important. So I think continuing that work that's done through the UC systems, so that folks that you know, maybe don't have as many resources, you know, that can't hire consultants to do this kind of work, that they still have avenues for access. So those are the big ones for me.
Thanks. Janaki?
Yeah, I'll just give a real life example of one farmer that we work with on the Central Coast who is kind of located centrally to a project area where all around his farm are a settlement of farm workers and also people who are just rural residents who are facing extreme nitrate pollution, 5 or 6 times their legal limit of nitrate, and 50 or 60 milligrams per liter of nitrate in their water. And this individual farmer has personally moved into that place maybe 3 years ago and is beginning to implement some of these soil management practices. He has invited us and our staff and local community members onto the farm to talk through what some of these practices are, and also to learn about what these the drinking water concerns are. And what this has done is it's allowed us, not only in a very practical sense, to have his allyship in constructing an immediate solution, which is the construction of a pipeline that's going to bring safe and affordable drinking water to this community. We now have, an ally who's a large land owner in that area, but also to be able to engage the issue of environmental justice when he goes about to seek some of these supports, whether it's through climate-friendly agriculture programs or other kind of land management practice programs that are available, to be able to say, like, this is a residential community that I live in. I support these people through employment, and that is a safe and healthy employment place. And that is a coalition that's very rare for us, unfortunately, still. And my hope is that this, as having a fundamental landing place of healthy soil, and that as a common goal, allows for more of that coalition building across the agricultural industry and our communities, especially when it means shifting to organic land management practices, because there's still a lot of farmers that do healthy soils practices or growing organic matter, but continuing to use Roundup and other agrochemicals.
Thank you, Janaki and Hannah. We really only have a couple minutes left, but I want to make sure that I get your input on this.
Yeah, sure. I think I'll just echo what I said earlier about land tenure. I think that's like a huge barrier to more equitable food system and farming, and who is managing land and has an input and a say on what our food system and agricultural system looks like. And so I think and I think those high rental prices and cost of land really do, push an incentive to produce as much as you can out of that parcel. And that might work against other ecosystem services that soils provide, such as regulating climate, carbon sequestration, filtering water. And so I think we really need to address the land tenure and issue.
Thank you. Well, we covered a lot of ground in this conversation. I hope you all learned something, because I'm certainly taking away a lot from this. Thank you to Janaki, Hannah, and Charles for sharing your perspectives with us. Also, thank you to everyone who joined us today. We really hope you enjoyed the conversation. Our next webinar of the series will be on Thursday, June 1st, and we'll be talking to growers and food companies about barriers and solutions to increasing grower adoption of soil health practices throughout the supply chain. We hope to see you there. The registration page will be up in the next few weeks, so please stay tuned. And if you'd like to follow Sustainable Conservation's work, please find us on social media, subscribe to our email list, or please consider supporting us with a donation by scanning the QR code on your screen. Thank you again for joining, and we hope to see you again in June. Have a wonderful day.